Hey there, history lovers. If you're getting ready to drift off, get comfortable, close your eyes, and let's travel back in time. Tonight's story begins with a 70-year-old grandmother who went to bed as a respected village healer and woke up accused of flying naked to Satan's midnight parties. Imagine cobblestone streets echoing with screams, smoke rising from public squares, and entire communities convinced their neighbors were secretly evil. This is the real story of the European witch trials, and it's far stranger, darker, and more human than the myths you've heard. Picture this. You're living in 1580, somewhere in rural Germany. Your neighbor, Martha, has been helping deliver babies and brewing herbal remedies for decades. She's that sweet old lady who knows exactly which plants cure your headache and always has a kind word when you're struggling. She's delivered half the babies in your village and saved countless lives with her knowledge of herbs and healing. But then little Anna from the village gets sick with a fever that won't break. Someone whispers that maybe Martha gave her the evil eye. Maybe that strange birthmark on Martha's shoulder isn't just a birthmark. Maybe it's where the devil himself touched her. And suddenly, faster than you can say, trial by combat, this grandmother who spent her entire life helping people is being dragged to a courthouse to explain why she was allegedly seen dancing naked around a bonfire with demons last Tuesday night. The wildest part? Nobody questioned how dozens of witnesses could have seen this supposed demon orgy, yet somehow forgot to mention it until it became convenient. It's like if your entire neighborhood suddenly remembered they saw you robbing a bank, but only after you got promoted at work and they got jealous. But here's where it gets really twisted, and this is the part that should keep you awake at night. These weren't random accusations thrown around by ignorant peasants drunk on too much ale. Oh no, this was a carefully orchestrated system, supported by the church, endorsed by governments, and executed with bureaucratic precision that would make modern corporations jealous. We're talking about a period where being a woman who lived alone could get you killed, where knowing too much about herbs could sign your death warrant, and where something as simple as your cow giving less milk than usual could spark a murder investigation with you as the prime suspect. The European witch trials weren't just about superstition gone wild, they were about power, control, and what happens when fear becomes more valuable than truth. Between 1450 and 1750, an estimated 40,000 to 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft across Europe. That's roughly 200 people per year burned, hanged, or drowned for crimes that literally could not have happened. To put that in perspective, imagine if we decided today that anyone caught doing yoga was clearly practicing dark magic and deserved to die. That's essentially what happened, except instead of yoga, it was things like "she looked at me funny," or "her cat is unusually friendly," or "she owns too many books." And the evidence they used to convict these people? Oh, you're going to love this. We're talking about courts that considered unusual moles as proof of devil worship, where floating in water meant you were guilty and drowning meant you were innocent but sadly dead, and where confessions extracted through torture were considered more reliable than your friend's testimony that you were actually at home baking bread during your alleged Satan meeting. Legal systems that would examine women's bodies for devil's marks, which could be anything from a mole to a scar to a patch of dry skin. Courts where your fate might depend on whether a piece of metal sank or floated when thrown into water. Yes, really. So tonight, as we dive into this madness together, we're going to explore not just what happened, but how entire societies convinced themselves that their neighbors were flying around at night causing crop failures and cursing livestock. We'll meet the men who made careers out of finding witches in every village, the legal systems that threw logic out the window, and the ordinary people whose lives were destroyed by the deadliest case of mass hysteria in human history. Because understanding how smart, religious, well-meaning people convinced themselves to murder thousands of innocents isn't just a history lesson. It's a warning about what humans are capable of when fear overrides reason, and how quickly civilized society can turn into something unrecognizable. To understand how entire societies went completely insane and started burning their neighbors, we need to step into the shoes of someone living in 15th century Europe, and let me tell you, those shoes were probably made of wood and filled with anxiety. This wasn't exactly what you'd call the good times in European history. We're talking about a continent that had just survived the Black Death, which killed about 1/3 of the entire population between 1347 and 1351. Imagine waking up one day and finding out that every third person you know is just gone. Your neighbor, your baker, maybe your entire family, wiped out by a disease nobody understood. That kind of trauma doesn't just disappear when the plague ends, it settles into the collective psyche like a permanent scar. People were desperate for explanations, for someone to blame, for some sense of control in a world that had just proven how powerless they really were. The church, which had always been the backbone of medieval society, was facing its own crisis of faith. How do you explain to your congregation that God allowed a third of humanity to die horribly while priests died just as often as sinners? The answer, apparently, was that Satan had clearly upped his game, and evil was literally everywhere, hiding in plain sight. Enter the Catholic Church's response to this existential crisis: the Inquisition, but with a new target. If plagues could appear out of nowhere, if crops could fail, if babies could die for no apparent reason, then obviously dark forces were at work. And who better to blame than people who were already on the margins of society? Elderly women, widows, healers, anyone who seemed a little too different or a little too knowledgeable about things normal people didn't understand. But here's the really twisted part. This wasn't happening in some backwards, isolated villages. We're talking about a period when Europe was actually becoming more educated, more connected, more civilized. The printing press had just been invented in 1440, books were spreading ideas faster than ever before, and yet somehow this technological advancement was used to spread manuals on how to identify and torture witches. It's like if the internet had been invented specifically to share conspiracy theories about your neighbors being secret demons. The political landscape was equally chaotic. The Holy Roman Empire was fragmenting into hundreds of small principalities, each with its own ruler desperate to maintain power and legitimacy. Local princes and bishops found that witch trials were an excellent way to demonstrate their piety to the church while also confiscating the property of anyone they convicted. It was like a medieval version of civil forfeiture, except instead of claiming your car had drugs in it, they claimed your grandmother had been consorting with demons. The Little Ice Age, which began around 1400, was making life even more miserable. Crops were failing, winters were brutal, and people were literally starving. When your harvest fails for the third year in a row and your children are dying of hunger, you don't usually think, gosh, this climate change thing is really problematic. You think, someone is cursing our fields and I'm going to find out who. The Protestant Reformation, which exploded across Europe starting in 1517, added another layer of religious paranoia. Suddenly, it wasn't just about being Christian versus pagan, now you had to worry about being the right kind of Christian. Catholic areas tried to prove their doctrinal purity by rooting out witches, while Protestant regions did the same thing to show they were more righteous than those corrupt Catholics. It was like a deadly game of religious one-upmanship, where the score was kept in body counts. Universities were actually teaching courses on demonology. Scholarly men with impressive degrees were writing learned treatises on how to spot a witch, how to extract confessions, and why torture was not only acceptable but necessary for the good of society. This wasn't ignorant mob violence. This was systematic, institutional murder with academic backing. Legal systems that had been developing for centuries suddenly threw out basic principles like innocent until proven guilty and burden of proof lies with the accuser. Instead, they created a legal framework where being accused was essentially the same as being guilty, where the only question was how quickly you'd confess and how many other people you'd implicate before you died. Economic instability meant that people were looking for scapegoats for their financial troubles. If your business was failing, if your crops weren't growing, if your cow stopped giving milk, well, obviously someone had cursed you. And conveniently, that someone was probably that weird woman down the street who lived alone and seemed to know a suspicious amount about herbs. The stage was perfectly set for mass hysteria. A traumatized population, religious authorities eager to prove their relevance, political leaders looking for easy targets, economic hardship demanding explanations, and a legal system willing to abandon logic in favor of fear. So now that you understand just how crazy these beliefs were, let me introduce you to the man who took all this supernatural nonsense and turned it into a systematic murder manual. And trust me, calling Heinrich Kramer a piece of work would be the understatement of the millennium. In 1487, this German clergyman published a book called Malleus Maleficarum, which translates to The Hammer of Witches, and it essentially became the best-selling how-to guide for identifying, prosecuting, and executing people you suspected of witchcraft. Think of it as witch hunting for dummies, except instead of teaching you a useful skill, it taught you how to torture your neighbors to death based on absolutely zero evidence. Kramer was basically that guy we all know who becomes obsessed with a conspiracy theory and then writes a 500-page manifesto about it, except his conspiracy theory involved Satan recruiting middle-aged women to destroy Christianity, and his manifesto became one of the most popular books in Europe for the next 200 years. The book was such a success that it went through at least 14 editions and was translated into multiple languages. This was basically the medieval equivalent of going viral, except instead of cat videos, people were sharing detailed instructions on how to torture confessions out of suspected witches. What made the Malleus Maleficarum so dangerous wasn't just that it codified existing superstitions, but that it presented them with the authority of religious scholarship and legal precedent. Kramer claimed that his methods were not only theologically sound but legally necessary, arguing that the traditional rules of evidence and procedure were inadequate when dealing with supernatural crimes. The book is divided into 3 parts, and each one is more disturbing than the last. Part 1 basically argues that anyone who doesn't believe in witches is either stupid or secretly a witch themselves, which is a pretty effective way to shut down criticism. Kramer provides theological proof that witches exist by citing Bible verses completely out of context and referencing classical authorities who were obviously talking about something entirely different. He argues that God allows witchcraft to exist to test the faith of good Christians, and that denying the reality of witches is tantamount to heresy. Part 2 is where things get really specific and really horrifying, because this is where Kramer explains exactly how to identify a witch, and his criteria are so broad that basically any woman who has ever annoyed anyone could qualify. According to the Malleus, signs of witchcraft include being unusually beautiful or unusually ugly, being too quiet or too talkative, showing too much emotion or too little emotion, having medical knowledge, living alone, having pets, owning books, being poor, being wealthy, having children, not having children, being married, being unmarried, being widowed, and basically existing while female. The book specifically argues that women are more susceptible to witchcraft because they are intellectually inferior, more carnal, and have slippery tongues that make them prone to spreading evil. Kramer's misogyny is so extreme that it's almost cartoonish. He literally argues that the word femina comes from fe meaning faith and minus meaning less, so women are etymologically destined to have less faith than men. Part 3 is the practical manual that explains exactly how to conduct a witch trial, and this is where Kramer reveals himself to be not just a religious fanatic but a genuinely sadistic psychopath. He provides detailed instructions on how to strip suspects naked and examine their bodies for devil's marks, how to design torture devices that will extract confessions without technically killing the accused too quickly, and how to manipulate legal procedures to ensure convictions. The book recommends that suspected witches be kept in solitary confinement, deprived of sleep, and subjected to psychological manipulation before any physical torture begins. Kramer suggests that investigators should promise mercy to get confessions, then break those promises because deals made with witches aren't binding. The really twisted part is that Kramer presents all of this as a work of scholarship and legal reform. He includes extensive citations, references to canon law, and arguments about proper judicial procedure, creating the impression that witch hunting is not only legitimate but intellectually sophisticated. The book's success was partly due to its timing. It was published just as the printing press was making books widely available, and it appeared during a period when religious and political authorities were looking for ways to demonstrate their piety and maintain social control. But the real genius of the Malleus Maleficarum was that it gave people permission to act on their worst impulses while feeling righteous about it. If you were jealous of your neighbor's success, suspicious of the midwife who knew more about medicine than you did, or simply looking for someone to blame for your problems, Kramer's book provided a holy justification for destroying them. So now that you understand just how crazy these beliefs were, let me introduce you to the man who took all this supernatural nonsense and turned it into a systematic murder manual. And trust me, calling Heinrich Kramer a piece of work would be the understatement of the millennium. In 1487, this German clergyman published a book called Malleus Maleficarum, which translates to The Hammer of Witches, and it essentially became the best-selling how-to guide for identifying, prosecuting, and executing people you suspected of witchcraft. Think of it as witch hunting for dummies, except instead of teaching you a useful skill, it taught you how to torture your neighbors to death based on absolutely zero evidence. Kramer was basically that guy we all know who becomes obsessed with a conspiracy theory and then writes a 500-page manifesto about it, except his conspiracy theory involved Satan recruiting middle-aged women to destroy Christianity, and his manifesto became one of the most popular books in Europe for the next 200 years. The book was such a success that it went through at least 14 editions and was translated into multiple languages. This was basically the medieval equivalent of going viral, except instead of cat videos, people were sharing detailed instructions on how to torture confessions out of suspected witches. What made the Malleus Maleficarum so dangerous wasn't just that it codified existing superstitions, but that it presented them with the authority of religious scholarship and legal precedent. Kramer claimed that his methods were not only theologically sound but legally necessary, arguing that the traditional rules of evidence and procedure were inadequate when dealing with supernatural crimes. The book is divided into 3 parts, and each one is more disturbing than the last. Part 1 basically argues that anyone who doesn't believe in witches is either stupid or secretly a witch themselves, which is a pretty effective way to shut down criticism. Kramer provides theological proof that witches exist by citing Bible verses completely out of context and referencing classical authorities who were obviously talking about something entirely different. He argues that God allows witchcraft to exist to test the faith of good Christians, and that denying the reality of witches is tantamount to heresy. Part 2 is where things get really specific and really horrifying, because this is where Kramer explains exactly how to identify a witch, and his criteria are so broad that basically any woman who has ever annoyed anyone could qualify. According to the Malleus, signs of witchcraft include being unusually beautiful or unusually ugly, being too quiet or too talkative, showing too much emotion or too little emotion, having medical knowledge, living alone, having pets, owning books, being poor, being wealthy, having children, not having children, being married, being unmarried, being widowed, and basically existing while female. The book specifically argues that women are more susceptible to witchcraft because they are intellectually inferior, more carnal, and have slippery tongues that make them prone to spreading evil. Kramer's misogyny is so extreme that it's almost cartoonish. He literally argues that the word femina comes from fe meaning faith and minus meaning less, so women are etymologically destined to have less faith than men. Part 3 is the practical manual that explains exactly how to conduct a witch trial, and this is where Kramer reveals himself to be not just a religious fanatic but a genuinely sadistic psychopath. He provides detailed instructions on how to strip suspects naked and examine their bodies for devil's marks, how to design torture devices that will extract confessions without technically killing the accused too quickly, and how to manipulate legal procedures to ensure convictions. The book recommends that suspected witches be kept in solitary confinement, deprived of sleep, and subjected to psychological manipulation before any physical torture begins. Kramer suggests that investigators should promise mercy to get confessions, then break those promises because deals made with witches aren't binding. The really twisted part is that Kramer presents all of this as a work of scholarship and legal reform. He includes extensive citations, references to canon law, and arguments about proper judicial procedure, creating the impression that witch hunting is not only legitimate but intellectually sophisticated. The book's success was partly due to its timing. It was published just as the printing press was making books widely available, and it appeared during a period when religious and political authorities were looking for ways to demonstrate their piety and maintain social control. But the real genius of the Malleus Maleficarum was that it gave people permission to act on their worst impulses while feeling righteous about it. If you were jealous of your neighbor's success, suspicious of the midwife who knew more about medicine than you did, or simply looking for someone to blame for your problems, Kramer's book provided a holy justification for destroying them. So the Malleus Maleficarum is out there, spreading across Europe like the world's deadliest self-help book, and suddenly everyone thinks they're an expert on spotting witches. And let me tell you, this played out exactly like you'd expect when you give paranoid people a manual for justifying their paranoia. It's like when social media first taught everyone they were doctors, detectives, and political experts, except instead of arguing about vaccines and Facebook comments, people were literally murdering their neighbors based on medieval conspiracy theories. The first communities to really embrace witch hunting were often places that were already dealing with social tensions, economic problems, or political instability, basically anywhere people were stressed out and looking for someone to blame. What's fascinating and horrifying is how quickly ordinary people adapted to this new reality where anyone could secretly be a servant of Satan. Within just a few years of the Malleus being published, you start seeing court records from across Germany describing cases where entire villages had turned into surveillance states, with neighbors watching each other for signs of supernatural mischief. Imagine if your homeowners association suddenly had the power to execute people for suspicious gardening practices, and you'll get a sense of how this played out. The pattern was depressingly predictable. It usually started with something going wrong that needed an explanation. A crop would fail, children would get sick, livestock would die, or some other misfortune would strike a community, and instead of chalking it up to the normal hazards of medieval life, people would start looking around for someone to blame. The Malleus had taught them that witches were everywhere, hiding in plain sight, causing exactly these kinds of problems, so obviously the solution was to find the witch and eliminate them. What made this particularly insidious was how the accusations usually targeted people who were already vulnerable or marginalized in some way. The first witches were typically elderly women who lived alone, widows without family protection, healers and midwives whose medical knowledge seemed suspicious, or anyone who had somehow offended someone with more social power. It's like if every workplace bully suddenly discovered they could get their targets fired by claiming they were practicing dark magic in the break room. The social dynamics were absolutely toxic. Once someone was accused, defending them became dangerous because it might make you look like a witch sympathizer, or worse, a witch yourself. People who had been friends and neighbors for decades suddenly found themselves choosing between loyalty and self-preservation, and guess which one usually won? Communities that had functioned perfectly well for generations started tearing themselves apart as everyone became simultaneously accuser and potential victim. What's really chilling is how quickly people internalized these new social rules and started policing themselves according to the Malleus guidelines. Women began changing their behavior to avoid seeming too knowledgeable, too independent, or too different from their neighbors. Midwives and healers either abandoned their practices or tried to make them seem more conventionally religious. Anyone who owned cats suddenly found themselves explaining why their pets weren't demonic familiars. It was like living in a society where everyone was constantly auditioned for the role of most normal person, because the alternative was death. The witch hunting craze also revealed some really ugly truths about human nature, particularly around envy and social resentment. Some of the earliest accusations came from situations where someone's success had bred jealousy in their neighbors. The farmer whose crops were doing better than everyone else's, the healer whose patients recovered more often, the woman whose husband seemed unusually devoted to her. The Malleus had provided a socially acceptable way to destroy people whose good fortune you resented, and plenty of people took advantage of that opportunity. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these early witch hunts was how they became self-reinforcing through the confession system. When someone was tortured into confessing to witchcraft, they were usually forced to name other witches they had supposedly worked with, which created an ever-expanding web of accusations. It's like a deadly pyramid scheme where instead of selling essential oils, you're selling out your neighbors to save yourself from being burned alive. These forced confessions meant that witch hunting could sustain itself indefinitely, because every witch you caught would inevitably lead you to more witches, creating the illusion that you were uncovering a vast supernatural conspiracy rather than just torturing innocent people into saying whatever you wanted to hear. Now, you might think that when religious and political authorities saw communities starting to accuse each other of supernatural crimes based on a book written by what was clearly an unhinged misogynist, they would step in and say, "Hey folks, maybe we should pump the brakes on this whole burning people alive thing," but you would be hilariously wrong because instead of stopping this madness, the authorities looked at the witch hunting craze and thought, you know what this needs? More organization, better funding, and official government backing. It's like if your local police department saw people conducting vigilante justice and decided the problem wasn't the vigilante justice, but that it wasn't efficient enough and needed better paperwork. The Catholic Church, which had initially been somewhat skeptical of Heinrich Kramer's work, they'd actually censured him for his extremist views and banned him from preaching in some regions, began to change its tune as witch hunting proved to be politically useful. Pope Innocent VIII had already issued a papal bull called Summis Desiderans Effectibus in 1484, which officially recognized the existence of witches and authorized inquisitors to investigate them. But after the Malleus became popular, subsequent popes doubled down on this position. By the early 1500s, the Church wasn't just tolerating witch hunts, it was actively promoting them as a necessary defense against Satan's assault on Christendom. Local bishops and priests found that conducting witch trials was an excellent way to demonstrate their theological sophistication and religious zeal, while also solving the practical problem of what to do with troublesome parishioners. It was like having a medieval HR department, except instead of terminating employees, they literally terminated people. The political authorities were even more enthusiastic about institutionalizing witch hunting, because they quickly realized that witch trials served multiple useful functions. They diverted public attention from economic and political problems, they provided a legal justification for confiscating property from anyone you wanted to get rid of, and they demonstrated your commitment to moral order in a way that impressed both the church and your political superiors. Prince-bishops, who combined religious and secular authority, were particularly drawn to witch hunting because it allowed them to project power in both spheres simultaneously. Some of the most notorious witch hunting campaigns were conducted by rulers who used supernatural accusations to eliminate political rivals, settle personal grudges, or simply terrorize their subjects into compliance. The legal system, which had been developing increasingly sophisticated procedures for determining guilt and innocence over several centuries, basically threw all of that progress out the window when it came to witchcraft cases. Courts that normally required multiple witnesses, physical evidence, and adherence to strict procedural rules suddenly adopted completely different standards for supernatural crimes. The reasoning was that since witchcraft was a secret crime committed in league with the master of deception himself, normal legal safeguards were not only inadequate but potentially dangerous. After all, Satan could manipulate evidence and influence witnesses to protect his servants. This convenient logic allowed judges to accept hearsay, rumor, and forced confessions as valid evidence, while rejecting alibi witnesses and character references as potentially corrupted by demonic influence. Professional witch hunters emerged as a kind of supernatural consulting industry, traveling from region to region and offering their services to local authorities who wanted to clean up their witch problems but didn't know how to go about it. These men, and they were almost always men, claimed specialized knowledge in identifying and prosecuting witches, and they often worked on commission, getting paid for each witch they successfully convicted. Matthew Hopkins, who called himself the Witch Finder General and operated in England during the 1640s, was probably the most infamous of these entrepreneurial executioners, but similar figures appeared across Europe, turning mass murder into a profitable business model. The bureaucracy that developed around witch hunting was staggeringly complex and surprisingly modern in its attention to detail. Official procedures for examining suspects, standardized forms for recording confessions, detailed expense accounts for torture equipment and execution costs, and careful records of property confiscated from convicted witches. Some regions developed specialized courts that dealt exclusively with witchcraft cases, complete with their own judges, prosecutors, and executioners who had developed expertise in extracting confessions and conducting trials. The whole system became self-perpetuating because it created economic incentives for continued witch hunting. Court officials, executioners, and property administrators all depended on witch trials for their livelihood, which meant they had professional reasons to keep finding more witches to prosecute. Now that the authorities had officially sanctioned witch hunting and created a whole bureaucratic apparatus around it, the next logical step was to develop foolproof methods for identifying witches, and I use the term foolproof in the most literal sense possible, because these methods were so stupid that only complete fools would think they proved anything, which unfortunately included most of the judges, lawyers, and clergy of the time. The evidence that courts accepted as proof of witchcraft was so laughably absurd that if you tried to use the same logic today, you'd be laughed out of any courtroom in the world and probably committed to a psychiatric facility. Let's start with what they called devil's marks. Basically any unusual spot, mole, birthmark, scar, or skin irregularity that could be interpreted as evidence that Satan had physically touched you to seal your demonic contract. Keep in mind that this was a time when people lived hard, physical lives without modern medical care, so literally everyone had scars, marks, and skin conditions of various kinds. But witch hunters had turned basic dermatology into a death sentence by claiming that any mark on your body that looked even slightly unusual was actually a supernatural tattoo indicating your membership in Satan's army. The procedure for examining suspected devil's marks was invasive, humiliating, and completely unscientific. Suspects would be stripped naked and examined by court-appointed officials who would poke, prod, and pierce any suspicious-looking spots with needles to see if they were insensitive to pain, because apparently Satan protected his servants by making their devil's marks numb. If you didn't scream when they stabbed you with a needle, it proved you were a witch. If you did scream, well, they'd just find another mark to test until they found one that didn't hurt as much, at which point they'd declare victory and move on to the next phase of your trial. The testing got even more ridiculous with the infamous swimming test, also known as trial by water, which was based on the brilliant theological reasoning that water, being pure and holy, would reject witches the same way it would reject any other unholy substance. The suspect would be tied up and thrown into a body of water. If you sank, you were innocent but probably dead from drowning, and if you floated, you were obviously a witch and would be executed for witchcraft. It's like a medieval version of heads I win, tails you lose, except instead of losing a coin flip, you lost your life either way. Some areas tried to make this more humane by pulling floating suspects out of the water before they drowned, but this just meant you'd die by burning instead of drowning, which wasn't exactly a huge improvement from the victim's perspective. Then there was the touch test, which was based on the belief that witches couldn't touch their victims without causing supernatural reactions. If someone who had accused you of witchcraft happened to have a seizure, fainting spell, or any kind of physical reaction while you were in the same room, this was considered proof that your evil energy was affecting them. This led to situations where accusers could basically perform on command, throwing dramatic fits whenever the suspected witch was brought near them, and courts would accept these performances as legitimate medical evidence of supernatural influence. It's like if method acting was a recognized field of forensic science, except the Oscar for best performance came with a death sentence for your scene partner. The obsession with finding physical evidence of witchcraft led to increasingly creative interpretations of completely normal phenomena. Unusual pet behavior became evidence of demonic familiars, knowledge of herbal medicine became proof of supernatural powers, and even being left-handed could be considered suspicious because it suggested an unnatural relationship with the sinister. Literally, since sinister means left in Latin and was associated with evil. Weather patterns, crop failures, and livestock deaths that would normally be attributed to natural causes were suddenly being treated as evidence of magical sabotage, with investigators working backwards from the assumption that if something bad had happened, a witch must have caused it, and then hunting for someone to blame. Courts began accepting spectral evidence, testimony about dreams, visions, or supernatural appearances that couldn't be verified by anyone else, as if hallucinations and nightmares were admissible in murder trials. The legal standard became so twisted that having a good reputation could actually work against you, because obviously the most dangerous witches would be the ones who were clever enough to maintain a facade of respectability while secretly serving Satan. So now you have this absolutely insane system where courts are accepting moles as evidence of devil worship and floating in water as proof of supernatural evil. And if you think the logical conclusion of this madness was just a bunch of random innocent people getting killed, you're underestimating human creativity, because it turns out that when you create a legal framework where anyone can be accused of an unprovable crime based on ridiculous evidence, people get really good at weaponizing that system for their own personal benefit. What started as a supposedly religious crusade against supernatural evil quickly became the medieval equivalent of swatting, where anyone with a grudge, a business dispute, or a romantic rivalry could essentially order a hit on their enemies by just pointing at them and yelling, "Witch." The beauty of witchcraft accusations from a sociopathic perspective was that they were almost impossible to disprove. How exactly do you prove you weren't flying around naked last Tuesday night, especially when the court has already decided that normal rules of evidence don't apply to supernatural crimes? Within just a few decades, communities across Europe discovered that witch trials had become the ultimate tool for settling every kind of personal dispute you can imagine. Property disagreements turned into witchcraft accusations when one neighbor claimed the other had cursed their land to be infertile. Business rivalries escalated to murder charges when competing merchants accused each other of using supernatural means to steal customers, and romantic triangles became death sentences when spurned lovers claimed their rivals had used love potions and demonic seduction. Inheritance disputes were particularly common triggers for witchcraft accusations, because what better way to eliminate your competition for grandma's estate than to convince a court that your cousin was actually a Satan-worshipping baby killer who had probably murdered grandma with dark magic in the first place? Women who refused marriage proposals, servants who demanded better working conditions, tenants who complained about their landlords, and basically anyone who had ever annoyed someone with more social power suddenly found themselves facing charges that carried the death penalty. The political applications were even more cynical. Local nobles used witchcraft accusations to eliminate rivals and consolidate power. Religious authorities targeted anyone who questioned church doctrine or seemed insufficiently pious. And government officials discovered that calling your political opponents servants of Satan was surprisingly effective at ending policy debates. It's like if you could end any argument by accusing your opponent of being a terrorist, except instead of just ruining their reputation, you could actually have them executed. The economic incentives created by property confiscation made the situation even worse, because convicted witches automatically forfeited all their possessions to the court, which meant that wealthy widows, successful merchants, and anyone with valuable assets became particularly attractive targets for accusations. Some regions actually started budgeting their government expenses around anticipated witch trial revenues, creating a system where local authorities had direct financial motivations to keep finding more witches to prosecute. It's like if parking tickets carried the death penalty and funded the entire police department. Children quickly learned that witchcraft accusations were a powerful weapon against adult authority figures they disliked. Students accused teachers who gave them bad grades, children pointed fingers at stepmothers they resented, and adolescents discovered they could eliminate parental supervision by claiming their mothers or fathers were practicing dark magic. The Salem witch trials, which happened much later but followed the same basic pattern, showed how effectively children could manipulate adult fears when they realized that their accusations would be taken seriously and could destroy any adult they chose to target. Professional relationships became minefields where any conflict could escalate to deadly accusations. Physicians accused midwives of causing deaths through supernatural means rather than medical incompetence. Established craftsmen eliminated competition by claiming new arrivals were using demonic assistance to undercut their prices. And church officials settled theological disputes by accusing their opponents of heresy that had crossed the line into witchcraft. The social fabric of communities began unraveling as people realized that maintaining good relationships with their neighbors wasn't just about social harmony anymore. It was literally a matter of life and death, because anyone who disliked you could potentially have you killed just by making the right accusations to the right authorities. Trust disappeared, paranoia flourished, and entire regions developed a culture of fear where people were afraid to stand out, speak up, or do anything that might attract the wrong kind of attention. Just when you think this story can't get any more insane, along comes a brilliant innovation that managed to make witch hunting even more ridiculous and deadly: the invention of specialized torture devices and testing methods that were supposedly scientific improvements on the crude techniques we've already discussed. Because apparently what the world really needed was more efficient ways to murder innocent people based on supernatural nonsense. Enter the era of what I like to call industrial strength witch hunting, where entrepreneurial executioners and innovative inquisitors started treating witch detection like a technical problem that could be solved through better engineering and more systematic approaches to extracting confessions. The star of this technological revolution was a charming device called the witch's chair, which was basically a metal seat covered with spikes that could be heated from below until it was red hot, because someone had apparently decided that regular torture wasn't quite uncomfortable enough and what the process really needed was the addition of slow roasting. Suspects would be strapped into this medieval Iron Maiden while interrogators asked them detailed questions about their supposed supernatural activities, and the combination of being punctured by spikes and slowly cooked was supposed to encourage truthful answers, which it absolutely did, in the sense that people would say literally anything to make the torture stop, including elaborate confessions to crimes that were physically impossible. But the real breakthrough in witch hunting technology came with the development of pricking, a procedure that involved using special needles to find insensitive spots on the accused person's body that supposedly proved their supernatural nature. Professional witch hunters developed entire sets of specialized tools for this purpose, including retractable needles that created the illusion of being pushed deep into flesh without actually penetrating the skin, allowing them to prove that certain spots were magically numb even when they weren't. It's like if magicians started using their sleight of hand skills to frame people for murder, except instead of entertainment, the end result was legal execution based on parlor tricks. The testing reached peak absurdity with the introduction of witch scales, because some genius had decided that witches would weigh less than normal people due to their supernatural nature, the theory being that Satan's influence somehow made his servants lighter than regular humans, as if evil was literally made of helium. Towns began installing special scales in their marketplaces where suspected witches would be weighed against Bibles, stones, or other objects, and if you were found to be too light for your apparent size, this was considered conclusive proof of your demonic nature. The Dutch town of Oudwater became famous for having honest scales that didn't automatically convict people of being underweight witches, but the very fact that this was noteworthy tells you how rigged most of these weighing procedures had become. Meanwhile, a new category of expert witnesses emerged: people who claimed to have special abilities to detect witches through supernatural means, often calling themselves witch smellers, or claiming to be reformed witches who could now identify their former colleagues in Satan's service. These individuals would travel from town to town offering their services to local authorities, and their testimony was often given the same weight as physical evidence because they supposedly had insider knowledge of how witchcraft actually worked. It's like if psychics were allowed to testify in criminal trials and their supernatural hunches could get people executed, which sounds completely insane until you remember that this actually happened regularly for over 2 centuries. Some regions developed elaborate ceremonies around witch executions that turned them into public spectacles designed to reinforce religious authority and social control. The condemned would be paraded through town in special costumes, forced to confess their crimes publicly, and then executed in ways that supposedly prevented their souls from escaping to rejoin Satan's army. The crowd participation in these events became increasingly theatrical, with audiences encouraged to watch for supernatural signs during the execution, like unusual behavior from birds, unexpected weather changes, or strange colors in the smoke from the burning pyre. These public executions became social events that entire communities would attend, complete with food vendors and entertainment, turning mass murder into a form of religious festival that normalized the idea that killing your neighbors was not only acceptable but holy work that deserved celebration. Now we need to talk about the darkest part of this entire nightmare, which is how the witch hunting system dealt with the obvious problem that most people, when accused of flying around naked with demons, would initially respond by saying, "What the hell are you talking about? I've never done any of that." And since the courts had already decided that witches definitely existed and were definitely guilty, they needed a reliable method for converting these inconvenient denials into the detailed confessions that would justify the executions they had already decided to carry out. The solution, naturally, was torture, but not just random, sadistic violence. This was systematic, legally sanctioned torture that was carefully designed to extract specific types of confessions while maintaining the pretense that the resulting statements were voluntary and truthful. The legal reasoning behind torture in witchcraft cases was both sophisticated and completely insane. Since witches had made pacts with Satan, they would be supernaturally protected from telling the truth about their crimes unless that protection was broken through physical suffering that forced them to abandon their demonic allegiances and return to God's protection, at which point they would naturally want to confess their sins and seek forgiveness. It's like if courts decided that the only way to get honest testimony from defendants was to hurt them until they agreed with whatever the prosecutors wanted to hear, which is exactly what happened, except they dressed it up in theological language that made it sound like a spiritual intervention rather than systematic torture designed to produce predetermined outcomes. The torture procedures were standardized and bureaucratized to an extent that would be impressive if it weren't so horrifying. Detailed manuals explained exactly how much pressure to apply, which body parts to target, how long to continue each session, and what kinds of questions to ask during different phases of the interrogation. Courts kept careful records of torture sessions, including notes about which techniques were most effective for different types of suspects, creating an institutional knowledge base for maximizing pain while minimizing the risk that victims would die before providing satisfactory confessions. The psychological manipulation was often more effective than the physical torture. Suspects would be isolated in dark, cold cells for weeks or months, deprived of sleep through constant interrogation, and subjected to mock executions where they would be prepared for burning or hanging before being told at the last moment that they could still save themselves by confessing. Many people broke under this psychological pressure before any physical torture was even applied, which allowed courts to claim that their confessions were completely voluntary since no actual violence had been used. The content of forced confessions followed predictable patterns because interrogators would coach suspects on what they were expected to admit. First you would confess to making a pact with Satan, then you would describe your supernatural powers and the evil acts you had committed, then you would be required to name other witches you had worked with, creating an ever-expanding web of accusations that could sustain witch hunts indefinitely. The specific details that suspects were forced to include in their confessions were often so bizarre and elaborate that they read like religious horror fiction. Flying to Sabbats where hundreds of witches gathered to worship Satan, participating in the ritual murder and consumption of infants, using magical ointments to transform into animals, and causing specific instances of crop failure, livestock death, and human illness through supernatural means. These confessions were then treated as historical evidence by subsequent investigators, creating a self-reinforcing cycle where new suspects were tortured until they confirmed the same impossible details that previous victims had been forced to confess, making the entire mythology seem more credible because multiple independent sources were saying the same things. The internal conflicts created by this system tore communities apart in ways that went far beyond the immediate victims. Family members were forced to choose between protecting loved ones and protecting themselves. Neighbors who had lived peacefully together for decades found themselves in life-or-death competitions to see who could most convincingly demonstrate their innocence by enthusiastically participating in the persecution of others, and religious authorities who might have privately doubted the reality of witchcraft found themselves trapped in a system where expressing skepticism could be interpreted as evidence of supernatural corruption. By the early 1600s, it was becoming clear to some authorities that maybe, just maybe, having local peasants accuse each other of supernatural crimes based on neighborhood gossip and personal grudges wasn't the most reliable method for identifying actual servants of Satan. So naturally, instead of concluding that the entire premise was flawed, they decided what the situation really needed was professional expertise. Enter the era of specialized witch hunters, traveling consultants who claimed to have developed scientific methods for detecting witchcraft and could bring their advanced skills to communities that were struggling with their local witch problems. These men positioned themselves as the medieval equivalent of efficiency experts, except instead of optimizing business processes, they were optimizing the process of murdering innocent people, and they were surprisingly good at marketing themselves as indispensable specialists whose services were worth whatever exorbitant fees they charged. The most infamous of these entrepreneurial executioners was Matthew Hopkins, who gave himself the impressive title of Witchfinder General, and operated primarily in East Anglia during the English Civil War, claiming to possess supernatural abilities that allowed him to identify witches with unprecedented accuracy, which he absolutely did not have. But he was extremely skilled at creating the illusion of expertise through theatrical presentations and manipulative interrogation techniques that consistently produced the confessions and executions that his clients were paying for. Hopkins traveled from town to town with a small team of assistants, presenting himself as a religious authority who had been specially called by God to root out Satan's servants, and he had developed a systematic approach to witch hunting that was designed to impress local officials while maximizing the number of convictions he could achieve in each location. His methods were basically a greatest hits compilation of every ridiculous witch detection technique that had been developed over the previous century, but presented with enough theatrical flair and pseudoscientific authority that communities who hired him felt like they were getting premium service for their witch hunting needs. Hopkins would arrive in a town and immediately begin examining all the women who had been accused of witchcraft, along with anyone else who seemed suspicious or had been denounced by previous suspects, using his expert techniques to identify supernatural marks, test for demonic familiars, and extract detailed confessions about Sabbath attendance and malevolent magic. His signature innovation was the swimming test, which he performed with great ceremony and scientific pretension, explaining to audiences that he had perfected the technique through years of experience and could now determine with absolute certainty whether someone possessed supernatural properties that would cause them to float in holy water. The psychology of Hopkins' operation was brilliantly manipulative. He would spend several days in each location conducting increasingly elaborate tests and examinations, building suspense and creating the impression that he was uncovering a vast supernatural conspiracy that had been hiding in plain sight, which made local authorities feel both vindicated in their decision to hire him and grateful for his expertise in exposing dangers they never could have detected on their own. By the time Hopkins finished his work in a community, he had typically identified dozens of witches, extracted confessions that implicated even more people, and created a narrative of narrow escape from demonic destruction that justified both his fees and the mass executions that followed his investigations. Hopkins claimed to derive his authority from a special parliamentary commission that had appointed him to cleanse England of witchcraft, though no evidence of such a commission ever existed, and he supported this fictional credentials with an impressive collection of testimonials from previous clients who praised his effectiveness in solving their supernatural problems, testimonials that were either fabricated or obtained from officials who were too embarrassed to admit they had been fooled by an obvious charlatan. The business model was ingenious in its simplicity. Hopkins charged communities a flat fee for his services, plus additional payments for each which he successfully identified and convicted, creating financial incentives that guaranteed he would find plenty of supernatural criminals wherever he went, regardless of whether any actually existed. So just when you think this story has reached peak insanity with professional witch hunters charging by the conviction, we arrive at what might be the most disturbing chapter in this entire nightmare. The moment when adults decided that children were not only reliable witnesses to supernatural crimes, but were actually better at detecting witches than grown-ups because their innocence supposedly made them more sensitive to evil, which led to situations where entire communities were destroyed by accusations from kids who were either genuinely confused, deliberately manipulative, or caught up in mass hysteria that no adult was brave enough to question. The logic behind treating children as expert witch detectors was typically medieval in its complete disconnection from reality. Since children were pure and uncorrupted by sin, they would naturally be able to see through the disguises and illusions that witches used to fool adults, making their testimony not just admissible but actually more valuable than evidence from mature witnesses who might be deceived by supernatural trickery. What this meant in practice was that if your 8-year-old neighbor claimed to have seen you flying through their bedroom window last night, or dancing with demons in the forest, or turning into a cat and stealing their porridge, courts would treat this testimony as if it were a sworn statement from a trained investigator, and your life would essentially be over because nobody was going to argue with a child's innocent perception of supernatural reality. The most famous example of this madness was, of course, the Salem witch trials in Massachusetts, where a group of young girls between the ages of 9 and 20 managed to destroy their entire community by claiming that various townspeople were tormenting them through supernatural means, and instead of adults saying, maybe these children are just being dramatic, the community decided that a vast conspiracy of devil worshippers had infiltrated their village and needed to be eliminated immediately. The Salem girls started with relatively small accusations against marginalized people like Tituba, a Caribbean slave, and Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, but as their performances became more elaborate and their audiences more credulous, they began targeting increasingly prominent members of the community, including church members, wealthy merchants, and eventually the wife of the governor himself, proving that once you give children the power to destroy adults through supernatural accusations, there's really no limit to how far things can escalate. But Salem wasn't unique. Similar cases occurred throughout Europe, where children's accusations led to mass executions that decimated entire regions. In Würzburg, a 7-year-old boy's claims about witch meetings resulted in the deaths of over 600 people, including his own uncle and several priests. In the French town of Lyon, children's testimony led to the execution of dozens of women who had been identified as participants in Sabbats that supposedly took place in locations where the children had never actually been. The psychological dynamics of these child-centered witch hunts were particularly toxic because once a few children made initial accusations, Other kids would often join in either because they genuinely believed they had also witnessed supernatural activity, or because they enjoyed the attention and power that came with being taken seriously by adults, or because they were afraid that if they didn't participate in the accusations, they might become targets themselves. Adults who might have been skeptical of individual children found it much harder to dismiss testimony when multiple young witnesses were saying similar things, not realizing that children are incredibly susceptible to suggestion and will often unconsciously coordinate their stories when they sense what adults want to hear. The interrogation techniques used with child witnesses were designed to extract increasingly detailed and dramatic accounts of supernatural experiences, leading questions that suggested specific details about witches' appearances and activities, rewards and praise for children who provided useful information, and implicit threats against kids who seemed reluctant to participate fully in the investigation process. The result was that children learned to perform their roles as supernatural victims with increasing sophistication, developing elaborate stories about how they were being tormented by spectral versions of their neighbors, and courts accepted these performances as legitimate evidence of magical assault, creating a legal framework where children's imaginations and traumas were literally being used as grounds for executing adults. Now, to understand just how completely off the rails this entire system had gone, we need to talk about what happened in Würzburg, a German principality where the local ruler decided that half measures and amateur witch hunting were for weaklings, and what his territory really needed was industrial-scale supernatural genocide conducted with the efficiency and thoroughness of a modern corporate restructuring, except instead of eliminating redundant positions, he was eliminating human beings, based on their alleged membership in Satan's army. Prince Bishop Julius Ector von Mespelbrunn, who ruled Würzburg from 1573 to 1617, transformed witch hunting from a sporadic local phenomenon into a systematic extermination campaign that would have impressed totalitarian regimes centuries later with its combination of bureaucratic efficiency, legal manipulation, and sheer murderous ambition. Ector wasn't some ignorant peasant who got carried away by superstitious fears. He was an educated Renaissance prince who spoke multiple languages, corresponded with scholars across Europe, and administered a complex territorial state with sophisticated legal and financial institutions. And he decided to use all of that administrative expertise to murder as many of his subjects as possible while maintaining the pretense that he was defending Christianity against supernatural assault. The Würzburg witch hunts weren't random acts of violence or spontaneous outbursts of community hysteria. They were carefully planned operations that combined legal proceedings, financial calculations, and political strategy in ways that turned mass murder into statecraft, with detailed records showing how Ector's administration budgeted for torture equipment, calculated the revenue from confiscated property, and coordinated with other territories to ensure that suspected witches couldn't escape by fleeing across borders. Between 1580 and 1650, the various prince-bishops of Würzburg oversaw the execution of approximately 1,000 people for witchcraft, which represents roughly 1% of the total population of the territory. Imagine if your local government decided to kill 1 out of every 100 people you know, and you'll start to grasp the scale of what happened in this supposedly civilized European state. The victims included people from every social class and background: peasants and nobles, clergy and lay people, men and women, adults and children, wealthy merchants and poor laborers, university students and illiterate farmers, basically anyone who could be plausibly accused of supernatural crimes, which turned out to be pretty much everyone once the system got momentum. Ector and his successors created specialized courts that dealt exclusively with witchcraft cases, developed standardized procedures for extracting confessions and conducting executions, and established a legal framework that made conviction virtually automatic once someone was accused, turning the entire judicial system into a murder assembly line that processed suspects with bureaucratic efficiency. The psychological terror created by these systematic witch hunts extended far beyond the immediate victims. Families were encouraged to denounce each other, servants were rewarded for informing on their employers, students were pressured to accuse their teachers, and neighbors competed to demonstrate their loyalty to the regime by identifying supernatural enemies in their communities, creating a culture of fear and suspicion that made normal social relationships impossible. The economic impact was equally devastating because the property confiscation that accompanied each execution meant that wealth was constantly being redistributed from executed witches to the state and its officials, creating financial incentives for continued persecution while simultaneously destroying the economic foundations of civil society through the elimination of productive community members and the constant threat of asset forfeiture. What makes the Würzburg case particularly chilling is how it demonstrates that witch hunting could function as a tool of political control that had very little to do with actual beliefs about supernatural crimes. By the time the persecution reached its peak, Hector's administration was using witchcraft accusations to eliminate political opponents, silence critics, confiscate valuable property, and terrorize the population into absolute submission to princely authority, proving that systematic murder disguised as religious duty could serve multiple practical functions for rulers who were willing to sacrifice their subjects' lives for their own power and profit. So for the first century or so of the witch-hunting craze, the system worked exactly as designed. It primarily targeted women, especially those who were old, poor, marginalized, or inconvenient to powerful people, which meant that the men who ran the courts, wrote the laws, and profited from the property confiscations were generally pretty happy with how things were going. But then something fascinating and terrifying happened that nobody had anticipated. The logic of witch hunting started eating itself, and suddenly the same accusations that had been safely destroying vulnerable women began targeting the men who had created the system in the first place. The turning point came when the forced confession system, which had always required accused witches to name other people they had supposedly worked with, began producing names that made the authorities extremely uncomfortable. Instead of just implicating more marginalized women, tortured suspects started naming prominent men, wealthy merchants, government officials, and even clergy members as participants in their alleged supernatural activities, creating a situation where the witch-hunting apparatus that had been designed to eliminate social undesirables was now threatening to devour the social elite. The psychological dynamics behind this shift were predictably human. When you're being tortured and told to name accomplices, you don't carefully consider the social implications of your accusations. You just desperately try to say whatever might make the pain stop, and if that means claiming that the local bishop was at last week's devil worship meeting, well, that's what you're going to claim, regardless of how implausible it might seem to people who aren't currently being burned alive. What made this evolution particularly dangerous for the establishment was that the legal precedents they had established for witchcraft cases made it almost impossible to dismiss accusations against men using the same standards they had applied to women. If unusual moles were evidence of devil worship when found on female suspects, they were presumably just as significant when discovered on male bodies. If floating in water proved supernatural evil in accused witches, it should logically prove the same thing when testing accused warlocks. If confessions extracted through torture were reliable evidence against women, they should be equally valid when obtained from men. The result was a series of cases that shook the foundations of European society, as prominent figures who had previously been enthusiastic supporters of witch hunting suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of accusations that they couldn't simply dismiss or ignore. Judges who had sentenced hundreds of women to death for witchcraft discovered that their own previous victims had implicated them in supernatural crimes. Government officials who had profited from confiscated witch property found themselves facing charges that would result in their own assets being seized. And clergy members who had preached about the reality of Satan's influence on earth were accused of being secret members of the very conspiracy they had claimed to oppose. The most spectacular example of this reversal occurred in Bamberg, another German principality, where Prince Bishop Gottfried Johann Georg Fuchs Dornheim conducted witch hunts so extensive that they eventually reached his own nephew, who was tortured into confessing that he had attended Sabbats with his uncle and other prominent church officials, creating a diplomatic crisis that required intervention from the Holy Roman Emperor himself. The panic that swept through the ruling classes when they realized that witch hunting could target anyone wasn't motivated by sudden moral clarity about the injustice of the system. It was pure self-interest, as powerful men who had been perfectly comfortable with murdering peasant women suddenly became very concerned about the reliability of supernatural accusations once those accusations started threatening their own lives and property. This wasn't a philosophical awakening about the dangers of mass hysteria, it was the political equivalent of leopards eating faces, where the people who had designed and supported a system of arbitrary persecution were shocked to discover that arbitrary systems are, by definition, arbitrary, and that the same legal frameworks they had used to eliminate inconvenient people could just as easily be used to eliminate them. The moment when powerful men started getting accused of witchcraft was like pulling the fire alarm in a building full of arsonists. Suddenly everyone wanted to talk about fire safety and the importance of careful investigation before jumping to conclusions about supernatural crimes. But the real shift in public opinion came from ordinary people who had watched this nightmare unfold for generations and finally reached the point where they'd had enough of living in constant terror that any neighbor, family member, or authority figure could have them tortured to death based on accusations that everyone secretly knew were complete bullshit. The popular backlash against witch hunting didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't driven by sudden intellectual enlightenment about the scientific method or rational skepticism. It was the cumulative result of communities that had been bled dry by decades of accusations, executions, and the constant fear that had made normal social life impossible, creating a situation where people gradually realized that the cure for supernatural evil had become far worse than the disease it was supposed to treat. The economic devastation caused by witch hunts had become impossible to ignore. Entire regions had lost significant portions of their population. Agricultural production had collapsed in areas where too many farmers had been executed as witches, and the constant property confiscations had created economic instability that was affecting everyone, not just the families of accused witches, making it clear that whatever benefits witch hunting might have provided in terms of spiritual protection were being completely overwhelmed by the practical costs of systematic persecution. The psychological exhaustion was equally important in turning public opinion against the witch hunters, because living for generations under a system where anyone could be accused, tortured, and executed for crimes that couldn't be proven or disproven had created a kind of collective trauma that made entire communities desperate for any return to normalcy, even if that meant admitting they had been complicit in murdering their neighbors based on fantasy and superstition. The credibility of professional witch hunters like Matthew Hopkins began to collapse when their methods became too obviously fraudulent for even the most gullible observers to ignore. When the same expert, who had identified dozens of witches in one town using swimming tests and needle pricking, was exposed as using retractable needles and rigged scales, it became harder to maintain the fiction that these men possessed genuine supernatural detection abilities rather than just being skilled con artists who had figured out how to profit from mass murder. Religious authorities started backing away from witch hunting as the Protestant Reformation created new theological priorities, and the Catholic Counter-Reformation focused on different strategies for demonstrating religious purity, while the rise of more centralized state governments meant that local princes and bishops had less autonomy to conduct their own personal witch hunting campaigns without oversight from higher authorities who were more concerned with political stability than supernatural purity. The emergence of early scientific thinking didn't immediately disprove the existence of witches, but it did introduce new standards of evidence and investigation that made the ridiculous proofs used in witch trials seem increasingly absurd. When scholars began studying anatomy, astronomy, and natural philosophy with systematic observation and logical reasoning, it became harder to maintain that floating in water or having unusual moles constituted reliable evidence of supernatural influence. The legal profession also began pushing back against witch hunting as jurists trained in Roman law and established legal precedents became uncomfortable with the procedural irregularities and evidentiary standards that had made witch trials possible, arguing that accepting testimony obtained through torture and allowing spectral evidence violated fundamental principles of justice that had been developed over centuries of legal evolution. Popular literature and folklore began reflecting growing skepticism about witch accusations, with stories and ballads that portrayed accused witches as innocent victims and witch hunters as corrupt villains, suggesting that public opinion was shifting away from seeing supernatural persecution as holy work and toward recognizing it as a form of sanctified murder that had gotten completely out of control. So after centuries of systematic murder disguised as spiritual warfare, European society slowly began to admit that maybe, just maybe, they had made a tiny mistake in burning tens of thousands of people based on evidence that wouldn't hold up in a modern traffic court. But the legacy of the witch-hunting era didn't just disappear overnight. It left permanent scars on European culture, legal systems, and social structures that shaped the development of modern civilization in ways that are still visible today if you know where to look. The most immediate legacy was a profound transformation in how European legal systems approached evidence and procedure. The complete failure of witch trials to produce anything resembling justice forced lawmakers to develop much stricter standards for what constituted valid evidence, leading to legal reforms that emphasized the presumption of innocence, the right to competent legal representation, and the requirement that accusations be supported by verifiable proof rather than speculation, superstition, or confessions extracted through torture. Ironically, the witch-hunting craze, which had represented the complete abandonment of rational legal principles, ended up accelerating the development of more sophisticated and fair judicial procedures as European societies tried to ensure that nothing like the witch trials could ever happen again. It's like how the worst disasters often lead to the best safety regulations, except instead of preventing industrial accidents, these reforms were designed to prevent government-sanctioned mass murder based on impossible accusations. The intellectual legacy was equally significant, because the obvious failure of scholarly authorities, religious leaders, and government officials to distinguish between reality and fantasy during the witch-hunting period contributed to the development of what we now call the scientific method. As European thinkers began insisting on empirical observation, reproducible experiments, and logical reasoning as the only reliable ways to understand the natural world, partly as a reaction against the kind of superstitious thinking that had made witch trials possible in the first place. The social consequences were more complex and troubling, because while European societies eventually stopped executing people for witchcraft, many of the underlying attitudes about women, authority, and social control that had made witch hunting appealing to begin with persisted in modified forms. The association between female independence and dangerous deviance, the belief that authorities had the right to eliminate people who challenged social norms, and the tendency to scapegoat marginalized groups for broader social problems all survived the end of witch trials and found new expressions in later historical periods. The economic impact of witch hunting created lasting changes in how European societies thought about property rights and inheritance, because the massive property confiscations that had accompanied witch executions had demonstrated how easily established wealth could be redistributed through legal manipulation, leading to stronger protections for private property and more complex inheritance laws designed to prevent authorities from using criminal accusations as pretexts for seizing assets from inconvenient people. The psychological trauma inflicted on European communities by generations of witch hunting contributed to a kind of collective cultural paranoia that influenced everything from religious practices to political movements. The experience of living under a system where anyone could be accused, tortured, and executed for imaginary crimes created a deep suspicion of authority that would later contribute to the development of democratic ideals and constitutional limitations on government power, as people who had seen what unchecked authority could do became determined to prevent future abuses through institutional safeguards. The witch hunting period also left a bizarre cultural legacy in terms of how European societies understood the relationship between knowledge and danger. The fact that midwives, healers, and other people with specialized knowledge had been disproportionately targeted during witch hunts created lasting suspicion of female expertise and contributed to the marginalization of traditional women's knowledge in favor of male-dominated institutions like universities and medical schools, effectively erasing centuries of accumulated wisdom about herbal medicine, childbirth, and healthcare that had been preserved and transmitted primarily by women. Perhaps most ironically, the witch-hunting craze, which had been justified as a defense of Christianity against supernatural evil, actually contributed to the secularization of European culture by demonstrating how religious authorities could use spiritual claims to justify obviously immoral actions, leading to growing skepticism about the political role of churches and the development of ideas about religious tolerance and separation of church and state that would have been unthinkable during the height of the witch-hunting period. Now you might be sitting there thinking, well, thank goodness we live in modern times when people are too smart and educated to fall for obvious nonsense and destroy their neighbors' lives based on impossible accusations and manufactured evidence. And if that's what you're thinking, then I have some absolutely delightful news for you about human nature and our stunning consistency in finding new ways to repeat the exact same mistakes while convincing ourselves that this time is totally different because we have smartphones and college degrees. The basic psychological patterns that made witch hunting possible, mass hysteria, moral panic, scapegoating, and the weaponization of accusations for personal gain, didn't disappear when Europe stopped burning people for supernatural crimes. They just found new outlets and adapted to new technologies, like a virus that keeps mutating but maintains the same basic function of making people sick. Consider how social media has essentially recreated the same dynamics that made witch hunting so effective. Anonymous accusations can destroy someone's life overnight, evidence is optional as long as the story fits popular assumptions, and once someone is labeled as a member of the evil conspiracy du jour, rational discussion becomes impossible because defending them makes you suspect too. It's like having a witch trial, except instead of a town square, it happens on Twitter, and instead of being burned at the stake, you get cancelled, doxxed, and permanently unemployable. The parallels are so obvious it's almost embarrassing. Just like medieval communities convinced themselves that their neighbors were secretly flying around with demons, modern societies regularly convince themselves that vast conspiracies are operating in plain sight, controlled by shadowy figures who are simultaneously incredibly powerful and incredibly stupid, depending on what the narrative requires at any given moment. We've had moral panics about daycare workers who were supposedly running satanic abuse rings, which led to innocent people spending decades in prison based on testimony from children who had been coached to say increasingly bizarre things about underground tunnels and ritual sacrifice. Sound familiar? It's basically the Salem witch trials with updated set design, complete with the same pattern of adults taking children's coach testimony as gospel truth and refusing to consider that maybe, just maybe, the kids were saying what they thought the grown-ups wanted to hear. The modern equivalent of professional witch hunters are the social media influencers and cable news personalities who make careers out of identifying new threats to civilization and explaining why normal people who disagree with them are actually dangerous extremists who hate freedom and want to destroy society. These people perform exactly the same function as Matthew Hopkins, traveling from community to community and offering their expertise in detecting hidden enemies, except instead of charging by the witch, they charge by the click in the subscription. We've seen how quickly entire communities can turn against longtime residents during political campaigns, neighborhood disputes, and cultural controversies, with the same basic pattern of escalating accusations, social ostracism, and economic consequences that characterized historical witch hunts, proving that the underlying human capacity for collective insanity hasn't diminished just because we have better dental care and indoor plumbing. The internet has actually made things worse in some ways because it allows communities to form around shared delusions and reinforce each other's paranoid fantasies without any contact with people who might introduce inconvenient facts or alternative perspectives. It's like creating custom-designed echo chambers where people can convince themselves that their neighbors are secretly members of whatever evil conspiracy theory happens to be trending that week. Modern conspiracy theories follow the same basic template as medieval witchcraft beliefs. Evil forces are everywhere but hidden. They're simultaneously all-powerful and easily defeated by true believers. They target innocent victims through supernatural or near-supernatural means, and the only solution is to identify and eliminate the secret enemies before they destroy everything good and decent in the world. The only real difference is that instead of blaming Satan, we blame political parties, ethnic groups, corporations, or governments, depending on our particular flavor of paranoia. The legal system has better safeguards now, but we've simply moved the witch hunting impulse into other institutions. Professional destruction through social media campaigns, economic warfare through boycotts and platform deplatforming, and character assassination through selective leaks and coordinated media attacks that can destroy someone's life just as effectively as a medieval execution. Except the victim gets to stay alive and watch their reputation burn in real time. So what exactly is the moral of this absolutely insane story about how European civilization spent 3 centuries systematically murdering innocent people based on accusations that were literally impossible to prove or disprove, using evidence that wouldn't convince a kindergartner, and legal procedures that would make a kangaroo court look like a model of judicial integrity? Well, the obvious lesson is that humans are capable of convincing themselves of absolutely anything if it serves their psychological, social, or economic interests, and that the combination of fear, authority, and mob mentality can turn the nicest, most religious, most educated people into enthusiastic participants in mass murder faster than you can say, "But she floated in the holy water, so she must be guilty." But the deeper, more disturbing truth revealed by the witch-hunting craze is that all of our civilizational progress, our legal systems, our scientific methods, our democratic institutions, our concepts of human rights, is much more fragile than we like to admit, because it turns out that smart people with good intentions can abandon centuries of legal precedent and rational thinking pretty much overnight if they're scared enough and someone gives them permission to blame their problems on a convenient scapegoat. The witch trials prove that education doesn't automatically protect against mass hysteria, religious faith doesn't necessarily make people more moral, and institutional safeguards are only as strong as the people operating them, which means that every generation has to actively choose to maintain civilized standards rather than sliding back into barbarism decorated with sophisticated justifications. The really depressing part is that the people who participated in witch hunting weren't monsters or psychopaths. They were ordinary folks who genuinely believed they were doing the right thing by protecting their communities from supernatural evil, which should terrify anyone who thinks that good intentions are sufficient protection against committing atrocities, because apparently you can torture innocent people to death while sincerely convinced that you're serving God and defending civilization. The witch hunting period also demonstrates that expertise and authority are double-edged tools that can be used to justify almost anything if the experts and authorities are sufficiently motivated to reach predetermined conclusions. The same scholarly methods that could be used to advance human knowledge were perfectly capable of producing learned treatises on the most effective techniques for identifying devil worshippers, proving that intelligence and education are morally neutral, technologies that amplify whatever values and assumptions their users bring to them. Perhaps the most valuable lesson from this nightmare is that skepticism and procedural safeguards aren't just intellectual luxuries for people who enjoy philosophical debates. They're literally matters of life and death. Because the difference between a civilized society and a murderous mob is often just a few institutional barriers that prevent fear and anger from being immediately translated into violence against whoever happens to be convenient to blame. The witch trials show us what happens when societies decide that being absolutely certain about something is more important than being actually correct, and when the desire for simple explanations and clear villains overrides the messy, complicated work of distinguishing between reality and fantasy, evidence and assumption, justice and revenge. But here's the thing that should really keep you awake at night. The same psychological and social forces that made witch hunting possible are still operating in human societies today, which means that our current legal protections, scientific standards, and cultural norms are the only things standing between us and our own potential descent into systematic persecution of whoever we decide to blame for our problems next week, next year or next decade. The witch hunting era ended not because humans became fundamentally better or smarter, but because European societies developed better institutions and cultural practices that made it harder for fear and hatred to bypass rational deliberation and due process. Institutions that have to be constantly maintained, defended, and improved, because the alternative is discovering that we're not actually as civilized as we thought we were. So the next time you hear someone advocating for shortcuts around legal protections because the threat is too urgent to worry about procedural safeguards, or insisting that certain types of people are so dangerous that normal rules don't apply to them, or claiming that anyone who questions their accusations must be complicit in whatever evil they're fighting against, maybe remember that those same arguments have been used to justify every atrocity in human history, including the systematic murder of thousands of innocent people who died because their neighbors got scared and decided that killing witches was more important than figuring out whether witches actually existed. So if you think the story of how Europeans convinced themselves to murder their neighbors based on floating tests and devil's marks was the peak of historical insanity, then you're going to absolutely love what I have planned for next week, because we're diving into a tale that's somehow even more bizarre, involves even more ridiculous evidence, and proves that when it comes to human stupidity, we haven't even begun to explore the depths of what our species is capable of when we really put our minds to it. Picture this. What if I told you there was a time when one of the most powerful empires in human history declared war on birds? Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally organized their military to conduct a systematic campaign against an enemy that could fly away whenever things got inconvenient, and that this wasn't some brief moment of collective madness but a sustained effort that lasted for months, involved thousands of soldiers, and was considered such a serious threat to national security that the government devoted enormous resources to fighting creatures that weighed less than a chicken? We're talking about the Great Emu War of 1932, when Australia, an entire continent-sized country with a modern military and supposedly rational government, found itself locked in combat with large birds that had the audacity to eat crops and exist in inconvenient places, leading to one of the most embarrassing military campaigns in modern history and proving that even 20th century nations with advanced technology could still make decisions that would have seemed crazy to medieval peasants. The setup alone is pure comedy gold. Australian farmers in Western Australia were struggling with emu populations that were destroying their wheat crops, so instead of dealing with this agricultural problem through, agricultural solutions, they convinced the government that what the situation really needed was military intervention, complete with machine guns, official army personnel, and a coordinated strategy for defeating an enemy that had never heard of military tactics and wasn't particularly interested in following the rules of conventional warfare. The government actually agreed to this plan, which involved sending soldiers armed with Lewis guns to conduct systematic operations against emu populations, treating large flightless birds as if they were an invading army that needed to be repelled through superior firepower and tactical coordination. Imagine explaining to your friends that you're being deployed to fight emus and trying to make that sound like a serious military assignment rather than an elaborate practical joke. The best part is that the emus, despite having no military training, no understanding of strategy, and no weapons beyond their natural ability to run really fast and be generally irritating, actually won this conflict by employing the brilliant tactical approach of scattering in all directions whenever soldiers appeared, making it nearly impossible for the military to achieve any meaningful victories against an enemy that refused to line up and be shot in an orderly fashion. The casualty reports from this war read like something from a satirical military history, with official documents describing how many rounds of ammunition were expended per emu killed, tactical assessments of emu movement patterns, and strategic evaluations of why traditional military approaches weren't working against opponents who didn't seem to understand that they were supposed to be intimidated by machine guns and uniformed soldiers. The aftermath was even more ridiculous, because the Australian military basically had to admit defeat against birds, leading to newspaper headlines and international commentary about how one of the world's modern militaries had been outsmarted by creatures with brains the size of walnuts, creating a diplomatic embarrassment that probably made Australia's allies question whether they could be trusted with serious military responsibilities. But the real kicker is that this wasn't an isolated incident of governmental stupidity. It was part of a broader pattern of human beings consistently overestimating their ability to control nature through force and underestimating the capacity of supposedly inferior opponents to adapt, survive, and ultimately prevail through simple persistence and the advantage of not caring about human expectations or military protocols. And there you have it, history lovers, the complete, absolutely bonkers story of how European civilization spent 3 centuries systematically murdering innocent people because they convinced themselves that their neighbors were flying around naked with demons, using evidence that wouldn't convince a modern jury that someone had jaywalked, let alone committed supernatural crimes punishable by death. And the truly terrifying part isn't just that this happened, but that it happened to societies that considered themselves sophisticated, educated, and morally superior to everyone else in the world. We've journeyed together through this nightmare of mass hysteria, institutional failure, and weaponized paranoia, from the twisted theology of Heinrich Kramer's witch-hunting manual to the bureaucratic efficiency of professional executioners like Matthew Hopkins, from the ridiculous evidence of floating tests and devil's marks to the systematic torture that produced confessions to impossible crimes, and from the children whose accusations destroyed entire communities to the moment when the witch-hunting system finally began eating its own creators, proving that no one is safe when fear becomes more powerful than reason and accusation becomes indistinguishable from conviction. The witch trials represent one of humanity's greatest cautionary tales about what happens when we abandon critical thinking, due process, and basic human decency in favor of simple answers to complex problems. And while we like to think we've evolved beyond such obvious madness, the psychological mechanisms that made witch hunting possible, the need for scapegoats, the appeal of conspiracy theories, the power of social conformity, and the human tendency to prefer comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths, are still operating in our modern world, just wearing different costumes and using different vocabularies to justify the same fundamental impulses to blame, exclude, and destroy anyone who makes us uncomfortable or challenges our assumptions. But hey, at least we can learn from these historical disasters and try to do better next time, right? Speaking of doing better next time, if you enjoyed this deep dive into historical insanity, then you absolutely need to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because next week we're exploring the Great Emu War of 1932, where Australia's military discovered that large birds are surprisingly difficult to defeat using machine guns and traditional military tactics, proving that the 20th century was just as capable of producing utterly ridiculous governmental decisions as any medieval court that ever burned a witch for having unusual moles. If this video helped you understand how smart people can make catastrophically stupid decisions when they're scared and looking for someone to blame, please give it a thumbs up and share it with anyone who needs a reminder that mass hysteria doesn't require ignorance or evil intentions, just fear, social pressure, and the willingness to abandon critical thinking when it becomes inconvenient. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments about which part of this story shocked you the most. Was it the complete abandonment of logical evidence, the systematic torture designed to produce predetermined confessions, the way children's accusations could destroy entire communities, or the fact that it took centuries for people to figure out that maybe burning your neighbors alive based on supernatural accusations wasn't the best approach to social problems? And if you have suggestions for other historical disasters that deserve the deep dive treatment, drop them in the comments below, because there's no shortage of times when humans have convinced themselves that obviously terrible ideas were actually brilliant solutions to their problems. Before you go, take a moment to really think about the lessons from this story, because understanding how witch hunting happened isn't just an intellectual exercise, it's a practical guide to recognizing the warning signs when modern society starts sliding toward the same kinds of systematic persecution. And maybe, just maybe, if enough people understand how these historical nightmares developed, we can avoid repeating them in new forms with updated justifications. Remember that the people who participated in witch hunting weren't monsters. They were ordinary folks who got caught up in a system that rewarded fear and punished skepticism, which means that all of us are potentially capable of similar failures if we're not constantly vigilant about protecting the institutional safeguards and cultural norms that prevent fear from becoming policy and accusations from becoming executions. Until next week, when we'll explore how Australia declared war on birds and somehow lost, keep questioning authority, demanding evidence, and remembering that the price of civilization is eternal vigilance against our own worst impulses. And if you made it through this entire dark journey with me, you've earned some respect for your dedication to understanding how humans can go spectacularly wrong when they're trying to do right, so give yourself credit for engaging with difficult history, instead of just pretending it never happened.